Welcome to 5 Books for Catholics, where an expert selects and explains 5 outstanding books in some aspect of Catholic life, doctrine, or culture. Modern science uncovers ever more evidence that evolution is behind the origin of man and every other biological species. For some, science thereby confirms that there is no need to postulate a divine creator. For others, we cannot accept evolution as it appears to be incompatible with the Bible's teaching on the creation of man. The Catholic Church, on the other hand, insists that revelation and science do not contradict one another and that we should inquire more deeply into each. Even so, many struggle to square the theory of evolution with the Church's teaching that God creates every human person directly. In this interview, Matthew Ramage discusses these problems and recommends some recent studies on the compatibility between evolution and the Christian faith. Matthew Ramage is a professor of theology at Benedictine College and an adjunct professor of sacred scripture for the graduate programs at Holy Apostles College and Seminary and St. Bernard's School of Theology and Ministry. His research and writing concentrates on the theology of Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, wedding ancient and modern methods of biblical interpretation, the dialogue between faith and science, and the development of a robustly Catholic approach to care for creation. He is a science and nature enthusiast and a scholar associate of the Society of Catholic Scientists. He is the author of The Experiment of Faith, Pope Benedict XVI on Living the Theological Virtues in a Secular Age, Jesus Interpreted, Benedict XVI, Bert Ehrman, and the Historical Truth of the Gospels, Dark Passages of the Bible, Engaging Scripture with Benedict XVI and St. Thomas Aquinas, and From the Dust of the Earth, Benedict XVI, the Bible, and the Theory of Evolution. The books discussed in this episode are, first, Faith, Science, and Reason, Theology on the Cutting Edge, by Christopher T. Baglow. Second, Thomistic Evolution, a Catholic approach to understanding evolution in the light of faith, by Father Nicanor Piergiorgio and others. 3. Theistic Evolution, a contemporary Aristotelian Thomistic perspective by Father Mariusz Tabashek. 4th, Creation Through Evolution, New Perspectives from Thomistic Philosophy and Theology, edited by Father Nicanor Piergiorgio. And finally, From the Dust of the Earth, Benedict XVI, the Bible, and the Theory of Evolution by Matthew Ramage. Links to these books are available in the show notes of this episode. And if you have a moment, please support this podcast by leaving a top rating on the platform of your choice. Professor Matthew Ramage, welcome.
Good to be here, Father.
First off, is evolution a scientific hypothesis, a fact, or a theory?
A theory. I subscribe at least to the view of science that it has to be inherently falsifiable or it's not science. And so I think theory would be the better word. It's definitely more than a hypothesis, as John Paul II famously said. I like to explain this to my students that a hypothesis is put out there as a possibility. It doesn't have proof for it yet, and it's reasonable to pose a hypothesis, but you still have to test it. But a theory is where a hypothesis has been tested, has proven not to be falsified, must be open to at least some revision, and yet offers a very strong explanatory framework. And I like to explain in that regard, like a lot of words say myth, it's gone through a devalued process here, and now people say it's just your theory, a synonym for which would be it's just your conjecture or opinion. But in science, no, theory is a well-established framework for understanding something. So that's how I would explain it.
And what is the current consensus within the scientific community over the mechanisms behind evolution?
Yeah, that's constantly developing. It's kind of neat to see, being a theologian who's interested in science rather than a PhD in science. Of course, that's a question best answered by a professional biologist. However, definitely natural selection remains part of it. Um, Recombination of DNA. There's a certain, as Thomists like myself would even say, a certain element of contingency or chance that goes into the process of speciation and genetic change. However, it's all governed by a teleology. And what I've been seeing in the literature is some recognition of an underlying teleology, actually. I like one analogy that I have seen, which is there may be some chance to how the rain falls, if you will, or to how a river arises. But once you have that current cut, there's only so many pathways it can take. So the Thomist, at least, the classically trained Catholic philosopher or theologian, is okay with some chance involved in the evolutionary process, but that is part of God's providence serving a greater goal, just like human freedom is as well. So definitely you have the role of natural selection within an underlying teleology. But yeah, survival of the fittest still has something to do with it. Absolutely. That the only dinosaurs that were fit to still survive after the great tragic events 66 million years ago that worked out pretty well for us were the birds, because they were most fit to survive in this climate where they could fly, have feathers, etc. And, you know, I'm an example of a human who would have been selected against if not for man's unique rationality, because I have lupus and have had kidney failure, heart issues that would have killed me already. So man is part of this process, but is more than the process. He's a rational animal, as Aristotle says, so he can transcend it, but he's also part of the evolutionary process, at least scientifically, and as our modern popes are definitely not only okay with, but kind of put forward.
And as you mentioned, you're a theologian. What prompted your interest and research on theistic evolution?
Yeah, this got started when I was in college. It might have been in 2001, and in my undergraduate years at the University of Illinois. I was just trying to defend the Catholic faith at a secular university. And one of the things you came across was that science disproves God. And Fides et Ratio, Faith and Reason by John Paul II, was a fairly new document, and he decried scientism, the reduction of all knowledge to the empirical sciences. And ironically enough, in high school in the 90s, I remember my freshman year of high school, I had a wonderful zoology professor, teacher, but he was a 6-day creationist and thought the world was 6,000 years old. And I was just an average, not even very strong Catholic. But I was struck by that and kind of the interest of defending my faith and science as well. And so just a love for the natural world, though, I'd say underlies it. I really learned from my parents getting outdoors, enjoying butterflies and getting out into the cornfields near our house. So it arose from a love of creation, a desire to defend the Catholic faith and to unite faith and reason. But then when I got to the university, I started at Benedictine College here in 2009, a great place to be. But I noticed students were increasingly being distraught by the incompatibility, so it seemed, of creation and evolution. And still today, my classrooms are across the hallway, and I'll have people not even in my classes come and ask me about this because they've heard either from a podcast atheist that you can't believe in creation, or they've heard more often, unfortunately, from Catholic personalities that thou must not believe in evolution. And so I've been increasingly interested in defending the classical teaching of the church and the unity of faith and reason and our popes on this matter.
Many, as you mentioned, find it difficult to reconcile Christian belief with evolution. Many even conclude that science thereby disproves the doctrine of creation. To what extent are such difficulties in conclusion based on a deficient understanding not just of science, but perhaps more fundamentally of philosophy?
Yeah, definitely the deficient understanding of science, right? I think that the classical liberal arts that we really advocate here makes room for learning this basic truth. Even my homeschooled children, my high school homeschooler is taking bio from one of my own colleagues here at the university, which is lovely, and they're learning the basics of evolution, and it's framed within the content of faith. The Dominicans, both the brothers and the nuns, have a Thomistic evolution project. There's even a movement to incorporate this at the high school level. They're doing some writing about that. So it's something we need to be educating people about, because there really is no rival scientific proposal that's reasonable unless you want to go down the direct 6-day creation, 6,000-year-old Earth. On that note, I've had honor students come to me. They ask me to teach a class. They can invent a class, and they have done a couple times a faith and science evolution class. And they had a homeschool curriculum that we've run across. And in that curriculum, it's basically Protestant, and they see these two as incompatible. So there's a scientific illiteracy problem. But like you said, there's a deeper philosophical problem here. And like Pope Benedict would say, it stems from a fear, maybe even an understandable fear, that once you open the door to modernity and you give an inch, it's going to take a mile. He actually says in the Divine Project, neat little book I have over here, that there's the fear that the faith will end up like a jellyfish and there's nothing to hold on to once you give something. But his response, like his friend Henri de Lubac, is that we must not fear that the faith is too weak to stand up to scrutiny, but it's actually a signal of the loss of faith that often goes on. I actually think that's my kind of quasi-pastoral experience trying to evangelize and form my students or people who send me emails on the internet. It's actually, the faith is strong enough to stand up to this. And not only that, we need the faith to have a voice. That has to be our philosophy, is we can't cede this territory to the secular realm.
What are the main magisterial teachings on evolution? What does the church teach about evolution?
Yeah, I think we need to begin in 1950 with Pius XII's Humani Generis, which is the only encyclical on evolution. And remarkably, that came out when the evidence was much less strong than it is now. Now we have multiple strands of science, from biogeography to genetics to homologous structures in different species to, of course, the fossil record, that pretty much all point in the same direction. But in 1950, Pius XII is the first pope to really officially address this in a systematic manner. And what he says is that it's acceptable for the Catholic to accept evolution of the body, but we must hold that the soul is directly created by God. And that still remains the teaching of other popes. I think Paul VI, John the 23rd, didn't really say much about this, if anything. And then John Paul II and Benedict said the most, and then Francis only tangentially touches on it. But yeah, so that's really, really crucial. And then he says, it is in no way apparent how you square polygenism with original sin. Polygenism, as Kenneth Kemp talks about in the 1940s and 50s, was the belief that humans arose on multiple continents. And the theory, quote unquote, which is really a hypothesis, was that, the white race is better. We arose in Europe, sort of thing. And then those black people are considered inferior. They evolved separately. And not only is Pius right to decry that theologically, because the human race is all one, it's actually scientifically completely false. And so anyway, we fast forward to John Paul II writing the letter to the Vatican Observatory head, Father Coyne, saying that evolution is more than a hypothesis and that we need to investigate whether an evolutionary perspective might shed more light on anthropology, man created in light of Christ. And then Benedict, that I really specialize in, oh my goodness, Benedict took this as something that is, well, he calls it, he says there's so many proofs in favor of it. It's now before us as a reality that we can see before our eyes. In many ways, he says it's the mechanism is a theory, but the reality that life gradually evolved is a fact. And so he really spent decades probing this. He wrote about it off and on. But I want to add an interesting angle into this. Just the other day, students came to my office asking me questions because they'd heard from a biologist basically that humans aren't unique because of evolution, it was claimed. And they asked me, well, Dr. Ramage, why doesn't the church come out and just declare evolution is true? And my first inclination when I get asked that every once in a while is, I kind of wish they would. But at the same time, the church should not, because the church knows that science does not belong in the realm of faith and morals. And so it really shouldn't be a magisterial declaration in itself, but also because the mechanisms of evolution are always going to be more and more deeply understood. And the last time the church wrote something fairly authoritative on this, you've probably seen this document, but the Communion and Stewardship document by the International Theological Commission is one that readers and listeners should definitely check out. It's not magisterial per se, but it's a Vatican curial body that then the magisterium stamps as orthodox. And it gives the dates. It says that mankind arose either as an individual or in populations around a couple 100,000 years ago in Africa. And that still remains largely accurate. But that would be best not put into a magisterial declaration.
Staying on Humani Generis, does Pius XII actually teach that God evolution entails that God does not correct the body directly?
If I understood the question correctly, he says in there that the body can evolve.
But does that mean God would have created? He doesn't. Does he actually opt for one hypothesis or the other?
Yeah, he leaves it open. Yeah. I mean, I don't know what's in his mind, but he seems to be, in my opinion, rooting against evolution. But he definitely is open to it. But Pius is a very interesting pope, of course, declaring the Assumption of Mary, but also he was very nuanced on biblical scholarship. His encyclical on interpreting scripture is quite an advance. He's the first pope who really opens the door to accepting the now well-established findings of modern biblical scholarship. So I really, really appreciate Pius on these matters.
And in Humani Generis, he teaches that there's an apparent incompatibility between polygenism, the descent of humans from more than one pair of parents, and the universality of original sin. Original sin is transmitted through natural generation from Adam to all humanity. Has this teaching been revised by a magisterial teaching of equal or greater authority?
No, it has not, I wouldn't say. No, it hasn't been revised anything nearly equal to that. The closest thing you get to is Professor Ratzinger kind of inquiring into this. A priest friend and I are working on a text to do with Ratzinger's lecture notes back on creation, and then he moved away from speculating too much when he became a bishop, as he reasonably should have. But the idea that there's one lineage is still well maintained. Ratzinger distinguishes, this is actually really important, he distinguishes polygenism from polyphylism. So to be polyphyletic, as in phylum, would be multiple lineages. But Ratzinger, he actually accepts polygenism in a sense different from Pius. And actually an increasing number of highly Orthodox Catholics are as well. So I'll explain what this means in a minute. But this summer I was on a panel with a couple lovely scholars on this subject, Kenneth Kemp and Father Mariusz Tabacek of the Angelicum. And I think we all agreed that, as Thomists largely speaking, that the first humans, Adam and Eve, had genetics from a very large population of prior breeding hominids in them. It's well-established science that the breeding population was at least several thousand hominins that were biologically almost exactly the way we were once we fully became human. So you could say polygenism, but it's a different sense of the word pious meant. So in modern terminology and the most up-to-date understanding of this, it's polyphylism that you really would have a hard time accepting theologically, that you had humans arise once, say, in sub-Saharan Africa and once in, super-Saharan Africa. And it doesn't even look like that's the case scientifically anyway, but it would be hard dogmatically to get to that point, maybe not impossible. What is very interesting to me, something Father Mariusz and I were talking about at the conference, is did it all happen at one single moment? And the magisterium leans in that direction, but it's not 100% clear. It has to have been an all or nothing on-off switch. But that's just a topic that we're currently probing.
And Scripture teaches that man is made in the image and likeness of God, but paleontology has identified, as you mentioned, various species within the genus Homo. Is Homo sapiens a species of Homo that is created in the image and likeness of God, or does the current state of paleontology suggest otherwise?
Yeah. As Ratzinger says, we're never going to be able to excavate the first human with a shovel. And, Ratzinger's preferred way to speak about what makes us uniquely human is that we're the only species capable of a relationship with God. From a Thomistic perspective, you could say only we have an intellect capable of concepts, only we have ultimately free will. But yeah, the science doesn't disprove that at all. The science becomes interesting when it can start to delineate when the latest or earliest this might have happened was. So, for example, we're having jewelry already a couple 100,000 years ago. If the Smithsonian is accurate, Neanderthals were making jewelry 250,000 years ago, and that there really are cousins that share a common ancestor that was already rational. And you can get arguments that by Homo erectus 2 million years ago we were already rational because they stood upright, they walked like us. This is now what you could call hypothetical rather than theory. There were some arguments made that they were already making fire and bringing them deep into caves that requires a forethought level that far outstrips anything else you see on the planet ever. So you could go back as far as 2 million years. Right now, Kenneth Kemp is very interesting on this. He has a similar dating to what you see in the evangelical fellow, I'm forgetting his name, not David Bentley Hart, William Lane Craig. And they kind of posit at the moment that it looks like we were rational by Homo heidelbergensis 750,000 years ago. And I don't have any horse in the race of when that was, whether it was an all or nothing or whether it was a gradual process. But I have a hypothesis on that of my own. But the point would be science can help us figure out when we must have at least been human, because as Aquinas says, we know the soul by its actions. And you can't have been making sophisticated eagle talon jewelry and be a mere chimp or something.
And you mentioned Kenneth Kemp. He's written a history of the debate between Christian theology and the theory of evolution. He sums up the thesis in the title of the book, The War That Never Was. Is that an accurate description or an oversimplification of the debate?
I love Kemp's book, and he's writing another one. I hope he can get that published soon, which will be really the magnum opus and the definitive history of Catholicism's engagement with this. The war that never was, we use that expression. I don't know if that's Ken's expression or the publisher's. Yeah, it need not be a war. I think you could look at the history of the church and say with Ratzinger and fully admit that with Galileo, we engaged in some warfare that we need not have been so severe with. Not that Galileo was treated poorly. My astrophysicist friends who specialize in this tell me he was actually treated quite well in his house exile. And no, he didn't have it all proven like he may have claimed he did. But ultimately, Galileo and Copernicus were basically right, and heliocentrism is correct, which is a theory, incidentally. You could call it a fact, but it's still an explanatory framework. And geocentrism was wrong, and the church and everybody in Western Civ had held that incorrect scientific worldview for millennia. But yeah, I think it's okay to say that there have been moments of battle, if not warfare, but that the church has always been pro science fundamentally, just like the church is pro man, even though we've not always been perfect on our record about slavery or the Jews or any number of things.
Some might argue that there are theological reasons for maintaining that God creates both the body and soul of our first parents directly, rather than by transforming some member of a pre-existing species of hominin into a new kind of creature. What are the main philosophical and theological arguments against special transformationism?
Yeah, I think in favor of direct creation of body and soul, you have just a literal plain reading of scripture would be a very, strong argument on that. Along with Ratzinger and John Paul, I'd say that's kind of illiterate from a literary genre perspective that Vatican II calls us to read Genesis from. As the Catechism 390 says, it's real events, but it's in figurative language. So I try to encourage people who kind of look at that as a direct creation apart from evolution. Do you guys really think he took dust and made mud? And usually they realize that's not meant to be literal. But in Genesis 1, the first creation account, it looks like God creates each species just through a fiat. And so, that would be the stronger argument there against transformationism on that. If that's the question, I would say it's just that combined with the church fathers didn't know about evolution. And so when we go look at the church fathers, of course, they're going to think each species came about individually.
No, I was thinking more along the lines of the argument that relies on the Thomistic concept of soul as the form of the body, which is also dogmatized in the Council of Vienne. Because if you have a pre-existing body in which God would have infused a new type of soul, that doesn't seem compatible with the soul's nature as the form of a body.
Oh, yes. Yeah, the Council of Vienne comes up in Kenneth Kemp and Mariusz Tabachek. They're both outstanding on this concept. They're better than I am on this concept because they have dug deeply into the wells of Thomism and have written eloquently. But I'll just give a little bit on that. So I'm along the same view as them, and I'd say probably the majority of Thomists, that if you take a really strong, appropriate hylomorphism, the soul and body have to conform, they have to be fit to one another. So, and I try to remind my students, ask, well, does this creature have a soul? Well, anything alive has a soul, of course, as you and I know. But most people don't realize soul has already been in anything that's alive. It's a spiritual soul that only man has. So, for example, Kemp takes up the discussion of the first human, if it's an all or nothing one-time affair, we have a continual fossil record that bespeaks the continuity of Homo sapiens. But let's just say it only happened one time. Then you would actually have the parents were still biologically human, but not spiritually, or he calls it theologically human. They had what would ostensibly be a true animal sensitive soul, but not fully a rational soul. And then whatever biological changes had to take place, the spiritual changes went along with, or vice versa. So people like Father Nicanor Austriaco of the Thomistic Evolution Project are great on this, that something had to happen. There are genes associated with language. You either have the language or you don't, whether the gene is activated or not. And so that's the research that some Catholic scientists are working on. but something had to have happened. But there's definitely biological continuity. And so the soul that would have been fit for that body would have had a share in rationality, but not been a spiritual soul. And when you go back to Thomas himself, it's actually pretty fascinating that he allows for even ordinary mammals to have a share in rationality. So that actually helps a lot with the question, because the proto-humans could have had many traits that were already more advanced than you would see in a species like chimps that we split from 6 million years prior to that.
Each of the books you've recommended argues that evolution is compatible with what God has revealed about the creation and fall of our first parents. Who makes the strongest case for the opposing position?
Oh my, that's a good one. I've read a lot of them, and I think they're all weak. What would be the best book I would recommend against it? I guess it would have to be a Thomistic book, because most of them are very six-day creationist fundamentalists that really don't know how to read the scriptures. But I think the thing to do, if someone's very interested, they should read in concert with each other Father Mariusz, it's like Marius with a Z, Tabachek, who's the one I've been talking about, and then read his Dominican confrere, Father Michael Chabarek. And he has a book called Aquinas and Evolution, and he is not a fan of evolution, let us say. And on the principle, among others, he argues that more cannot come from less. And so that's a dialogue that those two have had. And Father Mariusz's more recent tome, Theistic Evolution, to my mind, definitively answers all of Father Chabarek's qualms. But I think that's the one I would recommend.
Thank you for listening. To read or listen to the rest of this interview and gain full access to our archive, visit 5booksforcatholics.com and become a premium subscriber. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and give it a top rating on the platform of your choice. That way, more people can discover it. You can also support the podcast and help us produce more interviews like this one by making a one-off donation via the link given in the show notes. As little as $1, £1, or €1 can help and will be greatly appreciated. Thank you once again, and God bless.